So you feel called to be a missionary, and now you need to figure out where is God leading you to go. Now, in this video, I'm going to give you some really great common sense, practical steps to discern where God is leading. I'm also going to give you some questions that are going to help you think strategically on where missionaries are needed most. Because let's face it, if you feel called into missions, there's a lot of noise. You're talking about invitations from your city, nationally, all over the world. You're wondering, do I go to uncontacted tribes? Do I go to the mountains? Do I go to big cities? I mean, the sky is the limits, and these questions and steps that I'm going to give you in this video are going to help you cut through that noise. Now, let me just preface real quick that the questions that I'm giving you, we're going to start off talking more about like where is God leading. Then we're going to talk about some biases and influences in your life, and then I'm going to give you at the end some very strategic tools to help you figure out like what makes sense strategically with regards to missions and God's heart and where we need to be sending missionaries. These questions and the steps I'm going to be giving you are not questions that I just came up with on my own or by looking at some travel blogs and missions blogs. Much of this is built from and derived from years of study about missions, talking to long-term missionaries on the field who are doing church planting, and my own lived experience. My wife and I, we have over 29 countries that we've visited internationally doing missions work. I also have well over a decade of missions and ministry experience. I even met my wife on the mission field in Guatemala, although we were both from Virginia. So that being said, I'm bringing you all that I have to offer that I could think of and making a really simple but concise video to help you figuring out where is God leading you to go now. All right, so step number one is going to be all centered around prayer, but also some questions that I think it's worthwhile wading through as you pray and ask God where he may be leading you. So I'm going to be looking at my notes, and I just want to mention that while I look through my notes, there will be a link in the description that will actually take you to a worksheet that I've created that has all of these questions written out so that you can write down answers to them, and you can give this really thoughtful time and consideration while you pray. So when the video is done, go ahead and listen to the whole thing. But when the video is done, be sure to download that worksheet so that you can really take your time and pray through this. Let's get into it. First, consider how is God already at work in your life? Like maybe there are some repeat narratives or patterns or neighbors that you had from other countries that, like what were the catalysts that got you inspired in the missions in the first place? Was it missionaries from a certain country? Was it always hearing of this country and its influence in your church? But something to consider is just, has God been working in your life already, maybe through certain people groups, or have people groups been maybe the catalyst for a burden on your heart? And is that something that maybe God has been using to get your attention? That's something I like to consider. I'm not saying you should read into patterns. Don't do that. But I do think you should ask God, has he been trying to get your attention? How has he been trying to get your attention? And then, of course, being very open with like, God, is there a place that you are leading me? Also, do you already know anyone on the field? Is there already anybody that has like a big influence on your life that already are missionaries or are very missions oriented? But bringing back to the topic of prayer, those are things that I like to consider while I'm praying. I like to be asking God. And then more importantly is just seeking God, taking time to ask him, is there a place, is there a direction that he is leading you towards? Be sure to also include a opportunity to not just pray, but even fast while you're praying around this discussion of where, because you want to hear the Holy Spirit and you want to, again, cut through the noise so that you know where God is leading. All right, so I want to give you a couple of pro tips around the prayer point. First off, you probably already felt God put that call in your life, like you identify that leading to be a missionary. It is very possible that all you are going to hear from God is go, and then you're working through these next steps, and you should be praying about each step as you go. And sometimes you just have to go where you have peace. You don't have to hear God like a thus saith the Lord, this country, this people group. And I say that because it's a bit counterculture. Again, I'd say this is a pro tip. In certain church settings, you're going to feel pressure to like know the country and know the people group. And as you're praying, you may lead yourself to that conclusion instead of just saying, God's leading me to go, and this feels like the right next step. And so I would not over spiritualize or put too much pressure just because people think you should know what country. And I will also preface, like, if God gives you that direction, amazing. If he doesn't, everything is still fine and good, and we will get where we need to go, where God is leading anyway. And you can trust in his grace that he's going to, where he's going to lead you and guide you. He's going to provide all of that. That being said, I think it's actually in your favor not to feel fixated on a country or on a people group, because in the long term, the probability, again, this is going off of a lot of years of experience in missionaries that I know, if you get stuck on a country, then what happens when you know God called you, but the country you plan to go to doesn't work out because they won't accept your visa, or because you get kicked out the very first week that you try sharing the gospel, or because you get flagged at the border and they just realize like, hey, you're not legit. You're actually coming as missionaries, not as real business people. Whatever the case is, if you get fixated on a country and you just make that all about your thing, and then that country doesn't work out, which is a high probability, then you're going to feel derailed and you're going to have all these big what ifs and questions and doubts. Let me save you a lot of time, energy, and also hurt by saying it's better to focus on a region and also primary language. Now, people groups are going to fall into the country you're going to. It's easier to look at a country as a big picture, and then you can go to any of those people groups. But it's even better to look at a region, because by that region, you can go to all of the countries there. And if you get kicked out of one country, you can go to the next. If you don't get visas for that country, you can apply to go here. There's a lot of cross-pollination. And if you're going to make it long-term, you're more than likely going to be working in many different countries because of a lot of different things out of your control. When you think about primary language, that'll also help you focus on the region, because Arab world, they all speak Arabic. And if you learn Arabic, you can go to all of the Arabic speaking countries, right? If you learn Chinese, that is a primary language. So when you think about next steps, I would encourage you to be thinking about languages as well, regions, and then languages helping guide your direction on where. Now, I mentioned earlier, I'm going to help you be praying about this and also give you questions that are going to guide you as you pray. So these next questions, they're really kind of surface level. But when you're talking about living in uncomfortable situations and environments that are foreign, where you feel, you might feel vulnerable, you may feel isolated. These really simple questions that I'm giving you to be thinking about as you pray, they're going to add up to really big deals later when you fully have moved there or even moved your family there in the long term. So let me ask you some questions for you to be praying about as you consider next steps on where. Is there a culture that you are drawn to? Is there a culture that you just find beautiful, that you find really attractive, and like it piques your curiosity and you would love to learn about their history, their food, like how they go hunting in the woods, or you just love the big city life and the hustle and bustle? Like, that's a really great place to start, is just thinking about like what just sounds and like what would be fun, what fits your personality and the way that God has wired you. And there's nothing wrong with considering how has God wired you and how would that fit well with a region or people group or demographic that he may want to send you to. And again, we're going to talk more about like places of great need later. I'll help you dial it in, but this is to help you know better what may resonate well with how God has wired you. And so I think you should consider that to make it for the long term. Also, do you love big cities? Do you love the mountains? Do you love the jungles? Do you love the coast? Do you love cold weather? Do you love hot weather? Listen, if you hate cold weather, then I can tell you right now, like I would probably be avoiding the mountainous regions, but be looking more at like hot regions. That could be coast or that could be inland, right? But in the long term, you're not ideally going to just want to move towards a place where you're going to hate going outside every single day. Like, that's a really big deal. And the same on the culture thing. Like, if you're not like picking a culture that just fascinates you, like people are going to pick up on the fact of whether or not you really want to learn more about them and their culture, or whether it just feels like you're there because it's where you had to be. All right. So moving on now. Is there a team already located there that could train you? You're new and going into missions. You should not be going alone. You should be joining a team that is going to help you learn the culture, learn what missions is, learn the language, and learn how to share the gospel and make disciples in that culture, language, and context. Therefore, you want to see where teams already exist. We'll talk about teams, networks, and agencies on another video, so be on the lookout for that one. All right, real quick invite. If this video is helpful to you, or you have more questions that are coming out of this video, first off, I would love for you to subscribe. Next, please ask any questions you have related to missions or share feedback and insights. Maybe you have tips yourself because you have missions experience. Place those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you there. It'll also help me really kind of know better what videos to provide for the future to help you as you figure out next steps in missions. All right, big next step, consider biases. Now I'm going to start off with families because families have a huge impact, especially on singles and even married couples with young kids around like going to the field. They're scared to death of you leaving the United States, right? Like I personally had family that threatened to disown me and cut me out of the will and estate because I was going to a country that was really high risk, and there was a rift and there was no talking. And I chose Jesus over fear of being cut out, and God brought us back together. But my point in saying this is that your family will have a big impact on where you go if you let them. You need to be faithful to Jesus. You need to honor your family, but you need to obey Jesus and do your best to honor your family. And it may be that, Jesus said there comes a point in time where in order to follow him, we have to hate our mother or our brother, right? Like there comes a point where we have to choose Jesus over family. As you go into missions, this may be the very first time in your life where to obey Jesus and where he's calling you to go, where you may really have to choose to still in a loving, honoring way reject what your family would want you to do for the sake of the gospel. Church's input. Do they have any opinions about missions? Do they have any desired outcomes that they're wanting to focus on for the money they've already put into big programs and events and church buildings, already existing partners? And you may have a really healthy church that has a very healthy missions department and strategy. You may also have an unhealthy church that you've been a part of that you didn't realize that has no mission strategy or has a very weak, uninformed mission strategy. And so with this in mind, again, it's what does God put on your heart? And you weigh out the advice and the opinions and the biases that you're getting from family, from church, from me. I can tell you right now, I'm very biased towards sending missionaries towards the unreached, which we'll define later. Not towards places with full of Christians and that are high access. And so as you get direction and missions, you want to really try to think of why does this person encouraging this direction more than another? What leads into that perspective? And do you feel like it's valid, or do you feel like it's slanted and maybe it's missing some core components or just not in the direction that God's leading you to? So that being said, some biases are going to be good. Some are going to be less than ideal. And it's your job to hear the Holy Spirit as you wade through it. Denomination or network input. Again, they may already have existing works that they are working on, goals that they have, big focuses, and it may resonate with what God has put in your heart. And if so, you run with them. But it may also be something different than what God has put in your heart, and you may have to go against the current a little bit and join another group that you're not as familiar with to do and be faithful to what God has put on your heart. And that's okay, because at the end of the day, it's all one big C, one big church, right? A lot of different flavors and expressions. You certainly run with one that is not in conflict, with your conscience and core doctrinal beliefs. But you want to consider biases as you're getting input and influence on direction. That being said, your motives. I mentioned earlier my motives when it comes to bias around missions. One thing for you to consider, though, is like, what is driving you? As you're thinking about the where, let's talk about like poor motives. You just want to have fun. You just want a vacation. You just want to travel. Are you just picking an area that you think would be fun and very comfortable and would allow you to be at the beach, and you're going to be living a resort lifestyle, and you're not really going to meet an objective around missions and assignment for the kingdom, but you're looking to have an experience for a season of life where you do something good? Like, why are you doing this? And do you have any motives that are actually out of alignment with what God's heart is for missions and where he would really want to send missionaries? That's one that you will have to weigh out and discern and be honest with God about. And it doesn't mean that you missed God and that you didn't hear him. Like, he may be calling you to be a missionary, but now you may be really weighing out the cost of what that means. And you may need to repent of that and then say, well, God, where are you calling me? If that is the case. Also, On this very topic, the flip side of that would be fear. I mentioned earlier, families may have a background of racism or prejudice, or you may come from a different culture like the Northwest, the Northeast, or the South, or Central United States. And there are, at times again, on your side, you may be afraid of a certain environment, a certain people group, a certain demographic, and that could drive your own decision making around the where. And you need to not be led, nor do we want to be led by fear, but by God and by faith. And so you want to, again, examine your bias as you're thinking about regions and people groups. And, are there certain people groups where you haven't really given it consideration because your upbringing has taught you to avoid those people at all costs? All right. Another big note on biases has to do with general influence around missions and invitations. So oftentimes the first invitations and the loudest invitations that you are going to get when it comes to missions are going to be for areas that usually do not have the greatest amount of missionary need. That's not always the case. And again, it kind of comes back to that church discussion around their biases, which is going to be based off of where they've already been working and who they know in missions. And so when you think about this, let me share some stats with you. You're 2 times more likely to be a missionary if you know one, and it's 30 to 1. Like 30 times more missionaries are going to go to places with a ton of gospel access and also Christians. Only 3% are going to go to places that actually are working with unreached people groups, which is 40% of the world. So there's this huge imbalance. You're most likely going to only be invited in general to go to those places full of Christians and also high access in lieu of going to those areas where they have no access to the gospel. It's important to know this because as you're praying about where, you're generally speaking, unless you have a really healthy missions department and mission strategy at your church, more people are going to feel invited to the areas where there's not a huge need for missionaries. And I want to encourage you to swim against the current and go against the grain if you're in a setting where that's not been the invitation to the unreached, to really first study this and research and pray about and weigh out and discern and give this serious consideration and be okay with swimming against the current, even though so much of the invitation comes out of these places where there's not much need, to really give thought and consideration to the people who they don't have as many people advocating on behalf of them, because only 3% of all the missionaries are. All right, next up, I want to show you this awesome tool called the Joshua Project. And the best way to get there is you type in Joshua Project USA or your home country. I like to use your home country as a base because if you are going as a missionary, that means that where you're going would need to have much greater need than where you're leaving from normally. And so we should already be doing disciple making where we live. And when we're sharing the gospel where we live, that really is more defined as like outreach and evangelism, not missions. Missions historically is defined as going to those who have not yet heard the gospel. Now, I mentioned earlier that the majority of invitations are going to be from, most often, unless your church is really pressing into like frontier missions already, but a lot of churches are not yet, then most invitations are going to be areas that already have a ton of Christians or a lot of high access to the gospel. So I'm going to show you what this looks like practically using Joshua Project as a tool to weigh out and discern where you may consider going as you pray about where God is leading you to go. I like to use, and I'm going to share the screen while I keep sharing. I like to use your home country because it would be common sense that the country you go to just has much greater need for a missionary than where you are leaving from. And when I look at my own home country, the United States, you can see all these green dots are all of those dots are people groups. And if you guys share, like I'd be happy to do a video on Joshua Project and these terms and how to weigh it all out. But those are people groups, and you see there's a few red dots, a few red people groups. They're unreached, but we're more than capable of living among those people and sharing the gospel and reaching them with the gospel if we just get off of Netflix and live missionally, not just do church on Sunday mornings. Got it. Now, when you look at the United States, 76% are considered Christian adherent, 26% are evangelical. To keep this really simple for this video, the progress level is green. And I'm going to say the 26, let's go with the lower number, evangelical. And again, I can define all this later. But when we're looking at next countries, we're going to look at these same benchmarks and compare to where we already live. So I'm going to again use the evangelical number, the lower one. 26% are considered evangelical. And by the way, our growth rate, 0.8. Just keep that in mind. That's a whole other topic on the health of the church in the United States that I'd love to get into in another video. So I'm going to go over here to all countries. I am going to, remember I talked about regions. So let's just say you're thinking about the region of Central or South America. And so I'm going to pick a country here, Guatemala, in the region of Central America. And I can quickly go in and see like progress level green. People groups, green all over, one red. And they're still adding people groups. They're still learning. They're defined. Another video, rabbit trail. So that being said, you guys, like the evangelical percentage of the total population, 24. It's almost exactly the same as the United States. It's more Christian here in the United States. There's a lot of Catholicism. Jesus is not an unknown name or person in Central or Latin America. But as far as access to Jesus and Christians who live there, that is not much different than where we already live. And so you could say, like, do they really need you to leave and bring the gospel to them? Is it worth all the effort it's going to take for you to leave as a missionary and to go so that they can hear the gospel? No, it's not. And it actually, what we need is veteran missionaries coaching and helping and training Guatemalans to go as missionaries where the gospel is greatly needed. That is a strategic need. And if you're watching this video, that's probably not a need that you're able to fulfill yet. Maybe 10 years down the road as a long-term missionary, you could be a coach in Guatemala, helping them now do what needs to be done to continue to finish the task. So if Guatemala is not a location that we need to be sending missionaries because they have as many Christians and as much gospel access as we do, then where? Let's look at Africa, this area as a region. Well, let's just pick a country again in Africa. And Africa is huge. There's different areas, but I picked Nigeria. People groups, a lot of green, but there's a lot of red up in the northern border. So not every country, just because, if it's green, does that mean that like Christianity is everywhere? There's clearly a need for some pioneer frontier missions work to be done in the northern border of Nigeria, if I'm looking at this map. But as a whole, the population of the country, almost 26%, almost the same as the United States. That is wild. And their growth rate, much higher than the United States. And so where it would be strategic as far as missions and missionary sending goes is, again, having a veteran missionary work with Nigerians and them taking up that call to do frontier missions unto that northern region of their country where those unreached people groups are. That would be very strategic. But me sending you as a new missionary to bring the gospel to people in Nigeria, like, they're more than capable of finishing this task. That's the point. And not only could they finish this task, they're more than capable of sending and supporting themselves to go out to places where there's this need for missionaries. And if we keep sending them missionaries, they're probably not going to be very motivated and inspired to also send their own missionaries. They're going to, we're actually reinforcing the wrong message. Anyway, so now we move into, again, regions. When we think about regions, and as you're praying through this, I mentioned earlier, like, I have my own bias, unreached people groups when it comes to missions. And I want you to be thinking about the 1040 window as you're prayerfully considering. I'm going to show you another page and then come back and show you some countries within the 1040 window as a region. So you can just Google traveling team stats. It's a cool ministry. They do mobilizing, college campuses, talk about missions. And I'm going to share their tab. All right, so here is their page. They talk about the 1040 window. Here's a big picture of a map, and you can actually see it's like a darker gray right here in the middle. And that right there, that region, that zone, that is the 1040 window. And you can see Northern Africa, Arab world, Central Asia, Southern Asia, China, inland China, as a general rule of thumb. Like, this is your 1040, right? And it's called that because that window is West Africa across Asia between 10 degrees latitude north of the equator and 40 degrees north. If I didn't read it, I would totally get confused every single time. I've tried to say it perfectly without reading it, and I suck at it. So that being said, when you look at this other map, this is a really simple way to look at it further. If I zoom in, these big circles, these red circles, like, these are populations. And the greatest populations of unreached people groups on earth, which is actually 40% of the entire population of the world, they live in that region that we call the 1040. Northern Africa, Arab world, inland China, Southern Asia, India, all of that, right? And so this is the region, as you're praying about where, that I would encourage you to be thinking and really giving deep thought, and then be dialing into more like sub regions based on that primary language. Because when you figure that out, again, if you learn Arabic, you can go to all of the Arabic speaking countries as God leads, as you get kicked out, as you work yourself out of a job, as you start a nationally led, self-sustaining church planting movement. You can go to the next place where there is none, all of that. But now we kind of have an idea as to where we can be praying. So we're going to go back to Joshua Project. And when we're looking at Joshua Project, we can dial in, and I'm going to pick like India. Remember we looked earlier, like, the United States, Guatemala, Nigeria, tons of green, even the progress level, all green. India, deep red. All those people groups are red. And so the evangelical percentage, the percentage of the population, they don't even have a number. All right, so few. There are certain regions in India where there is more Christianity than others, but there is a great need for the gospel to be brought and to be established in India. All right, so that would be its own region, because India is huge, 1 billion people, 1 billion, 4 million. And then we'll go back to, again, countries. I'm going to pick one in the Arab world as an example. I'll do Iraq. So again, deep red, much fewer different people groups, but population as a whole, 45 million, they are less than 1%. Remember, we're at 26%. They're less than 1% evangelical. They are full of unreached people groups, and they are a country defined as unreached because so little of the population as a whole are already existing Christians. There's a great need for people to bring the gospel so that they can hear it, let alone choose to follow Jesus if they wanted to. And when you say Jesus, they may not know who you are talking about. They will not know the gospel unless someone shares that with them. And so an amazing, beautiful opportunity to send people there among many countries throughout the Arab world, throughout that 1040 region of the world. And so I want you to be thinking and praying in that direction as you pray about where. And so I would invite you to be thinking and praying about the 1040 region and looking at those sub-regions, be thinking primary language, and again, be asking God where, ask if there's a certain people group, certain countries, certain, cultural background, primary language, and then begin to dial it in based on probably where you're going to go for training. That's going to have a lot to do, because you're going to start in a training location to get down the core basics of doing missions, and then you're going to be able to even go more so to the people group or the country that has been more specifically on your heart from there. All right, so here's a bonus step real quick, and that is you want mentors in your corner as you do this. And one is just making sure that you have a pastor in your church who is behind you and winning your sales and walking this out with you, and they're going to be there to still care for you even when you make it to the field. They're not like releasing you and just letting the missions agency be your pastor now. Like, you still want a pastor, someone who cares deeply about you and your heart and your soul, and making sure that you make it long term, because you're you're spiritually healthy, you're emotionally healthy, you're taken care of on the field. Another mentor that you want in your corner, you want to know or find or go through, like maybe the network, the people you're thinking of, like get to know long term, boots on the ground, church planting, working with unreached people groups, Missionary, that you can maybe do some Zoom calls with and begin to ask them questions about what is it like on the field, what's it like on their team, their training, who they work with, the people they work with. Maybe do some interviews with missionaries in those different regions that you're praying about as you're trying to understand where God may be leading you, because that's going to help define what team you should join. Another video coming up. And finally, listen, you guys, please check out the worksheet that I have. There's a link in the description. It'll take you there. And I have a lot of other resources available to you. It's not just a worksheet, but I'm going to give you everything that I have. And I'll continue adding more and more tools and resources and people that are thought leaders around missions, so that you can really make it to the field and be set up to make it long term. That being said, check out this next video on how to become a missionary.